The game industry has been in a very difficult place over the past several months. Layoffs, budget cuts, studios being shut down. The list just goes on and on and on. And this has also recently impacted Square Enix, posting a less than stellar annual report as well as announcing layoffs, with no sales update being posted for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Multiple video game analysts have commented on the situation, saying that the game has indeed underperformed. I find this to truly be a shame because Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is the best Final Fantasy game that we've had in years, and arguably maybe one of the best ever. There is nothing pleasant about this situation. However, it does have me thinking, could this impact the development budget of Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3? After all, if Rebirth didn't do particularly well, and the third part will sell potentially even less, it leaves me wondering what they're going to do with the third game to ensure profitability. So if you love Final Fantasy, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We are on the road to 98k, and we are almost there. Help us hit 100k before the end of the year. First of all, it's important to note that the budget is often set during the initial phases of development. This means that a game like Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 probably already has its budget decided on. However, this doesn't necessarily guarantee anything. It is entirely possible that budget cuts could be made even while the project progresses. This is usually the worst case scenario, as it often means that they had already decided on the scope and then have to rework several things within the game in order to accommodate for a new lower budget. This becomes a troubling thought when you realize the insane scope of Part 3. The weapon fights, Wu-Tai, whatever is going on with the multiple worlds, playable Zack sections, the High Wind, all of the new mysteries, as well as the OG content concluding. As typical of most trilogies, with some notable exceptions like Mass Effect or The Witcher 3, but more typical and very typical of Final Fantasy sequels, it's likely that Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 will sell even less than Rebirth. After all, most of the people playing Part 3 will also have been the people who played and completed Part 1 and 2. The drop off there is simply natural and makes sense, but it's also why spending the same amount of money or more on Part 3 could be a potential risk. The counterpoint to this might be Sony exclusivity is up. Square Enix has said that they are targeting multi-platform now, and all the other platforms this is going to be available on will certainly make up for the fact that this is the third part, which typically would sell the least. Maybe. It's pretty likely that with the budget already set in place, that they might have already signed the deal with Sony again. It's really unknown whether or not they sign the entire trilogy at once, or if they do this on a game-by-game basis. However, it's entirely possible that this was signed before Rebirth even released. However, the end of the trilogy releasing on all platforms at that point, I'm not entirely sure if that would have the tremendous impact that we would hope for in this situation. It'd be difficult for me to imagine it blowing up the third part when other platform owners wouldn't have been playing the first two games. That being said, I don't think it's impossible for Remake and Rebirth to have Switch 2 ports, and I think that in particular will make the biggest difference in Japan. It's hard to say how much of a difference that Final Fantasy VII Remake's PC port made. We know that in 6 months the game sold 5 million units on PlayStation 4. That is officially confirmed numbers. The other officially confirmed number that we know is that Final Fantasy VII Remake in total has sold 7 million units. This means that the integrated version and the PC version are at least a huge part of that 2 million window gap, including anything else that the PS4 version sold after that announcement and before the release of Intergrade. Now, with all of this said, Part 3's budget might be lower anyways. There's going to be a huge benefit here thanks to a tremendous amount of asset reuse. Rebirth already gave us a fully fleshed out world map, which is going to be reused in the next game, along with a dozen other assets that will be used, such as character models of the main cast, code for things like the battle system, and much more. For example, they won't be making Queen's Blood from scratch. However, I think it's safe to assume they'll most likely be bringing it back, making some new improvements or twists on it, but in either case, it won't be as expensive as developing that minigame from scratch. Though in fairness, there have also been people that have said that Rebirth is just simply too much game, and they believe the game could have benefited from actually having a lot less in it. Now I know a lot of you in the comments are definitely going to push back on that, as you always want as much game as possible. I honestly don't have a clear take on this either way with this specific game, but it is important to note that there are some people that like to see the next game be a bit slimmer, and for the devs it gives them an out. Instead of saying that, oh, this and this happened with the budget, you can simply say, well, people didn't like all of the mini games, so we decided to reduce the total volume in this one. Please look forward to it. Though to be clear, I think that if Part 3 is a bit more concise, I don't necessarily think that'll be a bad thing either. I do think that pacing usually improves whenever a game's main story content is a bit shorter. All of this being said, Square Enix is ultimately faced with two decisions here. The first one being the one that I assume everyone, as well as myself, hopes for, and that is that Part 3 will see no significant scale down whatsoever, ensuring the same quality or greater than Rebirth's. The second is a logical seeming option from a business perspective, but in my opinion would hurt them more than any potential financial losses could, cutting the game's budget or scaling down to ultimately mitigate any potential losses. The morale damage that would be done would hurt more than this game breaking even or losing money. It would damage the one thing as a company that you cannot pay for. It would fundamentally damage brand loyalty. For the core audience, they would not trust Square Enix anymore. It's something that would damage the brand beyond repair in my opinion, and that brand loyalty is something that can't be simply purchased back at a later time. Of course, Square Enix has stressed previously that they need to grow FF to reach new audiences, and although this project didn't end up doing that in a tremendous, major way, for the core Final Fantasy fan, for the core Square fan, this trilogy has been something absolutely essential and something that has enriched their lives. So at this point, I don't think that there is any backing down. This being said, I do think that the Final Fantasy VII re-trilogy has given them the tools, the game design that they need to appeal to that wide audience. While playing Rebirth, I could only imagine how impactful this game would have been if it were Final Fantasy XVII. This volume of quality content set in a brand new accessible world with brand new characters, story, assuming that it got the same score, a 92 on Metacritic, and newcomers seeing that there was this brand new game that they could hop into or have any knowledge of anything else. I think that as a Final Fantasy XVII would have done incredibly huge numbers. Of course, as I previously mentioned, one of the barriers with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was that at the very least, players felt like they needed to play Remake first. Square Enix was aware of this, and they saw this as potentially bottlenecking their sales. Hence why such a strong part of the marketing was that you can start at Rebirth. I get the sentiment behind it. However, the thing is that people don't look at the company's marketing information, or post it on social media and ask other people where they can hop in. In my experiences running a very large RPG community, being chronically online on Twitter, and also observing real-life conversations about these topics, whenever someone considered even hopping into the first Remake game, people would immediately point them to OG and say that Remake is actually a sequel, and they stress that you need familiarity with the original game in order to truly get this remake. Now I know there's going to be pushback on that, as many people believe that this is still a remake in the traditional sense. Currently, we don't know. Sequel theories are valid, this just being a remake with extra twist, however you want to call it. There is literally no way to prove or disprove this at the current time, and everyone has their own reasons that they personally cherry-picked in order to believe what they do. However, one thing is fairly objective. A sizable number of people believe that this is a continuation of Final Fantasy VII, that is some sort of sequel or rebuild. I recently polled our community on this exact topic, asking them to fill in the blank. Final Fantasy VII Re-Trilogy is a, with 29% saying sequel, 13% saying remake, 54% saying rebuild with a new ending such as Evangelion, and 4% saying other. So there is this strong fan perception of this being a sequel to a remake sequel. There's no way to know what effect that ultimately had, but I imagine it couldn't have been conducive for getting new players to come into the game. I want to see the very best for Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3, and I want this trilogy to conclude in an incredibly satisfying way. And I hope despite all of the circumstances and the game industry literally falling apart, that Square Enix will still be able to deliver.